to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast. Each week we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe, offering exclusive insights, inspiration and guidance to help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in the early years. To hear about future episodes and access follow-up content, including ideas for your settings and more, sign up for exclusive access using the link in the podcast description. Well, hello. My name's Alice Sharp, your host for this week's TTS Talking Early Years podcast. Who am I? I would now describe myself, I think, as a trainer, an advisor, author, imagineer, disruptor, and a thinker. I started life as a civil servant, in fact, in the nuclear industry. My tiny little village where I lived had 2 missile bases at each end of the loch. However, I knew that was not for me very quickly and became a primary teacher. Then moved into early years reception, nursery, and I can't imagine anything else I'd rather be doing than working in early years. So we're here today. It's a fabulous little series. We are exploring the only way to learn, the best way to learn, play-based learning. In the early years, of course. We're using it, this one here today, to turn a lens on how play supports the development of key skills for our children. I get the joy over these series of talking to a number of educational experts, and today I'm delighted to introduce you to Kate Freeman, speech and language therapist and consultant, who is our guest today. Welcome to the podcast, Kate. How are you?
Thank you. I'm fine, thank you. Really nice to meet you.
Good, you too. And before we get started, I guess, Kate, it would be lovely to tell the listeners a wee bit about yourself.
Okay, all right. So my name's Kate Freeman. I am a speech and language therapist by background. I currently work as an independent consultant, supporting local authorities and various organisations around early years, around SEND, around speech and language. I'm also a registered intermediary, which means that I work with courts and the police, with vulnerable witnesses, and I'm also an author. I brought out my books last year around early language development and some books for toddlers, specifically aimed at that level of development.
Fantastic. Oh my gosh, that's a huge broad range that you're going to share with us today. How exciting. The first little thought bubble I thought we'd kind of put above our heads today, Kate. Before COVID, there was a report, lots of reports, I guess, about a 30 million word gap. It was suggested that there were 3 levels of vocabulary quite easily identified, with children from affluent families, children from less affluent families. And the different to exposure was up to 1,500 words an hour, I think. For some children, we're hearing 1,500 words an hour more than other children. And then, of course, COVID happened. So has that situation made it even worse for our children? Has it had huge impact on children's speech and language, Kate?
Yeah, it has had a huge impact. Really, what's happened is that the different groups of children who had more and fewer words has become wider. The gap has become wider. Yes, there is empirical evidence that it has had an impact. There's an organisation called Speech and Language Link who run interventions for children of all age groups. And they, because they're regularly in touch with schools and early years settings, and they gather data each year on how many children within those schools and early years settings have speech, language and communication needs. They were very able to check what was happening before the pandemic and what's been happening since the pandemic. And there definitely has been a note that there has been an increase in the number of children with speech, language and communication needs. I will say that some families were more able to support their children over COVID. I've been speaking through my work with local authorities, with some places where there were some children who were really struggling, but because actually the time during COVID was more focused with families, and there were less kind of distractions. For some children, actually, it's made a big increase in their level of development. So parents were better able to focus on their children's language. But obviously, it depends on what else was going on for parents and families during the COVID restrictions. And obviously, for lots of people, it was really, really difficult. So parents are having to juggle working at home and managing their children, and obviously there was mask wearing, and that prevented people from being able to see people's faces, and also the lack of opportunities for children and parents to socialise. So children were potentially, in some cases, more restricted in what it was that they were doing. So maybe they were in front of a screen much more, and we know that that's not great for children's language development. So unfortunately, it increased the gap between the children who are doing really well and who've got great interactive experiences at home, and the children who are not doing so well, and the children who are kind of, potentially more stuck in front of a screen and less talked to. And I'm sure the early years settings that we're talking to, will understand that, because I'm sure that they're finding that too.
And I guess really, if it was, that gap was there before COVID, and then we've had that situation for nearly 3 years, I guess now, and some have had a positive impact and experience of it, but some have had a negative impact. The gap is wider for some children, but it might have closed. But from an early years perspective, for us in our settings, what is it that we can think about, really? Parents and adults, obviously, it's really important that we respond positively to children's expressions and vocalizations. And, I feel sometimes that, having come through it myself, and certainly in conversations with other practitioners, we feel less chatty. We feel less responsive sometimes. And so we really need to encourage our practitioners, I guess, to tune back into that need for reciprocity, and to respond to the actions, emotions and words of our children.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually, around the idea of practitioners potentially feeling less chatty. And we know what supports children's language development. It's that backwards and forwards conversation. It's that responding to children in the moment. What is it that they're interested in right now, right in front of them? Not what the practitioner has on their mind, or, what might be happening yesterday or tomorrow. It's about really being with the children in the moment. But it's also about focusing on speech, language and communication as remembering that is the route to learning. We need to, obviously play supports the learning, but unless we have good language skills, we're not able to understand what people are saying. We're not able to necessarily engage others in our play. We're not necessarily able to make friends. We're not necessarily able to think in words, which we require to be able to understand concepts, to be able to encode memories, all of those kind of things. So language is so, so, so important. And it's about us remembering that and remembering to refocus on language. And sometimes people do that by talking a lot, which can be useful. But on the other hand, actually, children need silence as well, and they need time to process information. So sometimes reducing the length of our sentences. The rule of thumb is to speak in one word longer than the child uses with you. So sentences that are one word longer. So if a child's not saying anything at all, then really we need to be speaking in one word sentences to them. If they're saying 2 or 3, we need to be using 3 or 4 word sentences. And obviously, if they've got a lot more to say, then we can say a lot more to them.
And that's a really, really strong and powerful tip there, Kate, because I am a chatterbox. I love to talk. And so for me, to remind me of that, to remind us as early years practitioners that actually there is a process to be gone through to encourage that. When I read, first of all, about the vocabulary gap, I became obsessive, throwing as many words at the children as I possibly could. And then I remembered it's about tone and body language and all of the other aspects of how I communicate. But taking time to pause and think of something, that's quite a simple thing to think about. Yeah. And to respond in that way will make such a difference to the children. Yeah. I think that's brilliant, absolutely fantastic thing to help me think about that.
I'm pleased about that. It's also about using silence as a tool. Yeah. Sometimes, exactly as you've said, we feel like we need to just talk at children and they'll miraculously, like a sponge, learn all of that information. But they need time to process the information that we're providing for them. And so sometimes we just need to be quiet and respond to what it is that they're doing. And by being quiet, we can observe what they're doing. And then we can throw the odd word in that, that is about what it is that they're involved with. So if they're playing with the tractor, oh, I love the tractor. And just waiting. I did a set of training a very long time ago when I very first started being a speech and language therapist. I did a training for health visitors, and I did a video recording with a child that I was working with. And I do two different scenarios. One where I was talking all of the time and asking loads and loads of questions, and the child's language really reduced. They hardly said anything because they hadn't got a time to get a word in edgeways. And then the other one was where I used silence and I was just quiet and observing the child. And actually, if we observe them, then they will tend to fill that silence. We have to stop ourselves filling the silence, but they will tend to do that. And then we can respond to what it is that they're really interested in. And we know then that the conversation that we're having is about what they're focused on, and that's how they learn the new words. I had a conversation just at the weekend with my grandson, who's 4, about condensation. I thought, this is he went to the toilet, and my son had a shower, and there was condensation on the mirror, and he said, oh, I can't see myself. And I said, yeah, and that's called condensation. And we talked about how that happened. But if I'd have just sat down with him and said, this is about condensation, then it wouldn't have meant anything to him at all. So it's about
contextual. So context is really important, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I love the way you describe that. The silence, in fact, as a practitioner, will give me time to think of richness to offer, not just another question. What colour is this? How big is this? How many spots can you see? Because sometimes I guess as a practitioner, you're pressurised into thinking it's my job to encourage language to develop here. And you feel this huge pressure to talk. So that permission that you've just given us to be silent helps us process as well as adults. Because, we might be in a room sometimes with 40 other children, and we're trying to focus and have a conversation contingently talking with one child when all of this is going on. So sometimes you don't have a chance to pause and fill your head with richness of language. So that silence would allow us to do that, Kate.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you were saying about questions, because sometimes we do use more questions than we necessarily need to. We don't, when we're having a conversation as an adult, we don't say to them, what colour's your hair, or, what clothes are you wearing, because we can see that. And we should be thinking about the same with a child. What's the point of the question that we're asking? Is the point to test them? In which case, there's probably a different way of doing that. We can say, oh, I love that colour, and then wait. And they will probably say it's red if they know it. Or they'll say, yes, I like that colour, and I also like pink and blue and, green too. But to test children in that way of asking questions is not useful, and it doesn't demonstrate how conversations work. No. Conversations don't work in that way. Yes, somebody might drop something in and there may be a question attached, but then they're quiet, then they allow that response. And we don't, as adults, we don't ask questions where we know the other person knows the answer and we also know the answer, and we're just testing them. That's not
and you
really
can
how it
actually
works.
see that sometimes, Kate. When you see another adult, if you're observing your room, for instance, asking a question, you can almost see the child looking at that adult thinking, I know the answer to that, so why are you even asking me it?
Yeah, exactly.
Because again, it's that pressure, I think, that we sometimes have or put on ourselves, that we do have to fill all those silences, which we don't, because I can't remember where I read it, and I might not be quoting it correctly, but children think in words when they have the vocabulary, and they need time to gather them and get them out. And so if we don't give them the 10-12 seconds that it takes to do that, then you I guess you do hear them going much more silent than perhaps we want them to.
And actually 10 seconds is quite a long time to wait. It feels a long time, and we feel that we have to fill that gap because we feel that children can't fill it. But actually, if we do wait that 10 seconds, count silently in your head, but be anticipating that the child will say something, just wait, then they will fill it. I quite often on my training courses, give that as a task for people to just have a go with, just over the next week, try and wait for 10 seconds and see what happens. And people are surprised by the fact that children actually do come out with a lot more than we're expecting.
And as you said, it is a long time, because I've done similar things on my courses. And even when I'm the one that's counting the 10 seconds, I'm thinking, oh, for goodness sake, hurry up. But 10 seconds is 10 seconds. You can't hurry up. One of the things, just before we kind of move on, that I want to just pause and think about is the parents in all of this. Because I'm talking about it from a practitioner point of view, but COVID has had a huge impact on parents, and parents are with their children when we're not there. And all the reports are saying poor parental mental health impacts on the relationship with the child and therefore the response to the child. Positive home learning experiences predicts, as we know, higher levels of vocabulary, spelling, and wider literacy skills. And a lot of our parents, we've got a lot of rurality families, in the fisheries and in the farms, and the online support for them was there, but the issues they had with devices and connectivity, and they found it much more difficult, I think, to find support. And so for parents, what is there any kind of top tips for us as practitioners to encourage our parents to know about the silence and the contingent talk and all of that kind of stuff, Kate?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of great resources. A lot of them are online, but there's if you haven't heard of Tiny Happy People, that's a government campaign, which is particularly focused on speech and language. And there's loads of videos on there, loads of activities, loads of ideas for parents. There's also some posters that you can download from Tiny Happy People. Also, an organisation, it was called ICANN, it's now called Speech and Language UK. There's posters on there with top tips that you can download for parents, or put them in your newsletters. The other thing, I think, is getting parents together. So trying to find ways where parents can get together. Some settings I know are able to have, drop-in sessions or coffee mornings, or maybe at parents' evenings, or anything like that. Because I know I've got three grown-up children, but I know two of them particularly were becoming adult when COVID was, all the lockdowns were happening. And I know that they are, although they're both very outgoing people, they are finding it difficult to connect with people because they've missed that opportunity to do that. And things have changed. And so getting back into the way of connecting with people is really important. And I think that is a great role that early years settings can offer. I know I'm still, I meet regularly still with what I call my playground pals. They're the parents that I used to stand on the playground with while I was waiting for my children to come out of school. And they have provided me so much support of my, through my parenting, through all things that have been going on, relationships, health stuff, all of that's gone on over the last 20 years. And it all stems from those relationships that were developed when my children were very little. So anything that settings can do to support parents to do that, it would be really great.
Yeah. Sometimes I think parents don't know what they don't know, and it's our job to help them know it. And so those, even if we took 2 or 3 little messages from this conversation we've just had, about the importance of silence, or talking about what is actually going on just now, contingently talking to that is going to, through a conversation at the gate, as you said, or at the door, or as they come in to pick their child up, is going to be hugely beneficial, not just for the child, but for the parent-child relationship, which is going to make everything stronger.
Yeah, it's also about modelling, I think. Modelling when you're, as a practitioner, when you're talking to the child, making sure that you're down on their level, making sure that you're using short sentences, maybe making sure that you've got some, if you've been talking about what's been happening in the day, some prompts, physical prompts to show them, let's talk about the drawing that you've been doing, here's the drawing, all of that kind of thing. So it's modelling that so that parents see how to do that.
Okay, wow. From 10, 15 minutes of a conversation, I have got so much going on in my head. Thank you so much for that. That's just little bursts of provocations for thinking. Wow, thank you.
Brilliant, thank you.
All that remains for me to do, Kate, is to say thank you so much for joining us on our TTS podcast. It has been a joy.